for this particular talk, I thought a nice question would be, how do we get students to engage with non-tonal, atonal music, non-traditional music? How do we get their one-to-one teachers to engage with that music as well? Because we think it's worth it, because it opens up ideas, because it brings you new inspiration, because it really enriches your experience of all music. And I don't have any answers to this at the moment. These are some music psychological findings that people have found that I've kind of based some of the results that I'm going to show you on. So familiarity with a particular type of music increases the likelihood of an emotional response. This is from a study where a number of students went away with a number of different pieces of music, one Mozart, one Schoenberg, one Berlioz, and kind of logged their increasing familiarity and what responses they were having to the music as they listened to it every day. And Helen Danes found these results. Familiarity increases likelihood of emotional response. Expertise affects engagement with structure. So whether you're an expert, whether you've done your 8 hours of practicing a day, depends how quickly and easily you can engage with structure of form. Emotional responses are less consistent for atonal music because we're unfamiliar with it, because they were unfamiliar with that type of music. Large-scale form is more difficult to identify in atonal music because it's less memorable, because we're less familiar with it, and because there's a high dependence between tonal music and form. The form and the content, the systems make the form. So, bearing in mind that other studies have found that structure provides the key framework within which students try and learn music as performers, and the framework within which they interpret music and make their own creative interpretations of the music, how can we put all that together? What kinds of ways, what can I use to investigate this? How is atonal structure understood by students unfamiliar with that style? What do they do now when faced with something like that? And they are told, look at this and then play it. How can atonal structure be better understood more quickly? And then these are rather grand aims to suggest practice or teaching strategies to help understand structure away from tonality, structure and form, free form, all different kinds of forms that can help you with all different kinds of music and not just tonal music, in order to eventually increase engagement with non-tonal music so that they can experience what we've experienced, this new land, this new adventure into non-tonal music. So over the last 3 or 4 years, I've done 3 empirical studies. One of a singer learning a song by Schoenberg. It was song 4 with the first poem that I read. And then I tracked her understanding of structure as she went along, as she sung it through 4 rehearsals and a performance at the end. And she marked out on a score, and then I interviewed her about her thoughts. The second one, I call it a pilot, but it wasn't really. 27 people, analysis students, marking written scores. And here, this idea comes in, how does their understanding of form develop when they're looking at this visual stimulus compared to when they're hearing? What can we do to make the hearing experience be familiar and inspirational for them? And then what I'm looking at the moment is this eye tracking study with 55 people, and we tracked their eyes as they had first contact with an unfamiliar piece of music. And we tried to see how what they did with their eyes matches up with what they said they understood about the form of the piece. So I've got a lot of data. I haven't analysed it all yet, but there are a few bits and bobs. Now, the problem with this kind of empirical musicology is another polar opposite in musicology, where The very popular and up-to-date approach to music study at the moment puts the doing of music at the forefront, puts the process of music at the forefront, the person. And reading music psychological texts, I was getting frequently very frustrated at Mozart. All the time Mozart, okay, we're going to do a music study, what should we use? Mozart. Or if not Mozart, a couple of chords just on a stave, on their own. That's not real music learning. Real music learning is looking at this thing and thinking, whoa, there's a lot of notes on there. So I was getting very frustrated with that. So I wanted to try and study something real, a real experience. And the other thing is when you do these studies with lots of people, you always have to say your N number, how many participants you have, then you average everyone out, and then you say something about the general trends. But often in music, that's not that relevant because it's one person's interpretation you're going to that concert to see, and it's one analyst's interpretation that you're reading in your music analysis journal paper. So sometimes one person's decision-making can be just as important as the averaging out of 55 people. So there's a real tension there. And old-style musicology, you know, where you do have one analyst presenting their interpretation, has this individualistic kind of thing. But then music psychology has this, everything has to be statistically relevant. So there's a real tension there. So I wanted to bring those things together a little bit. So I'm going to present you some stuff from this one, number 2. Here is the score that I put in front of these people. These are all of the section boundaries that they identified across their short relationship with this piece of written music. I'm not going to play you it yet because I'm going to play you a bit later, and I want to keep this short. So these were the things that I was interrogating. Who decided that these places was the places where you would put your line to create your form and then to practice the piece within those lines, within that form? And here are the results. It's a shame the bottom is cut off there. Can I move that down a bit?
Doesn't help if that's...
No, not really. That's all right. You can see the tops of them anyway. So on the bottom here are the results from the 27 people. This is the whole song, very crudely photoshopped into one long line by me. These are the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H that were on the previous slide. And this is the number of people, relatively, who decided that those section boundaries existed for them in their first contact with the piece. So we can see here the most people found that. This one was also pretty popular. These two were pretty popular as well. On the top and on the bottom here with the brackets, I've got 1, 2, and then 3 and 4. These are the results from my case study, my singer, who had 4 rehearsals and then a performance of the song. In rehearsal 1, she identifies the song as having 3 sections, but they don't have a name yet. I must point out that this type of music hasn't got a traditional form. There's no rondo, there's no obvious ternary. There aren't any big double bar lines. There isn't even a key signature or a time signature for song 4. So it's written in a style that is called developing variation, where everything comes out of everything else, but there's no direct repetition, which is why I use this to interrogate this idea of form and experience. By the second rehearsal, the singer identifies this, and then this little one at the end here is a return, and this perhaps as a different section. By the third and fourth ones, she's changed her mind about where the return comes, and then she's also here with these extra little arrows identifying lots of different sections. Now, usually I talk about this in terms of the ecological approach to perception, where as familiarity increases, your idea of the general structure of something increases, and your awareness of the detail increases as well. And we can definitely see this happening here. But my point is this. This many people identified this as a section boundary. Some of them didn't identify that as a section boundary at all. Less people, fewer people, identified that as a section boundary. But again, some people didn't. Some people didn't identify either of these. And yet we would go to a concert and hear this singer sing this song. So who's to say that she's right? I've read a lot of analyses of these songs and of this style. Analysts don't agree. Some of them say, oh, it's in 2 sections. Some of them say, oh, it's in a developmental ternary form. Some of them say it's completely, there's no form whatsoever, it's completely free form. So I guess the question for me then is, how can we use what the student performer, how can we use what their interpretation and what their understanding, what they tell us their understanding is, to help us understand it quicker and to engage better with this type of music. This is for people who looked and then looked. So half of the experiment was people looking for 2 minutes at the score, marking it up, looking for another 2 minutes and then marking it up again. So with increasing familiarity but no listening. These red lines, sorry, things have moved around a bit. These red lines are where they've changed their mind, where a section is no longer important when the first time they thought it was important. So for those who just looked, increasing familiarity made these particular section boundaries less important. So 3 people changed their mind and said, this is no longer a section boundary. And in music psychology, you wouldn't be able to say that because it wouldn't be relevant, because it would be an insignificant result. But in music, of course, there is a significant result because one of these 3 people might be the person who's singing the song in the concert that evening, or the person writing the analysis paper. For the students who looked and then listened and marked again, the result is very different. So you've got, that's looking, and then that's listening. These ones that became less important in the first one became more important. So we can see that there is a real effect on understanding of structure when you're listening as well as looking, which is why you should never believe an analyst who's done an analysis just from the paper score, just from the notes on the page. They also had different opinions on what aspects of the music they found to be important. Those who listened, character and group dynamics became much more important. Those who were just looking, all these good stuff that you're taught in analysis to look for in the score as a little bit more important. Cadences, ranges, rests, rhythms, texture, pitches. Not so important for those who listened. So then I started looking at these 2 points, boundary G. Why did the lookers find this to be more important than the listeners? Or why did they change their mind in that sort of fashion? Started looking at what the characteristics of it were. But the main thing for me is this textural element. You've got a rest here, so you've got a big space. This is up high, this is down low. This and this in the accompaniment look very, very different. Visually, it's very different. And as you look more, you become more convinced of that. However, this, same range, same number of chords, doesn't look very different. This doesn't move very far, doesn't look very different, but identified by more listeners as being a section boundary. So this is a very simplistic kind of illustration of the effect that listening can have. And when instrumental teachers say, I don't want them to look, I don't want them to listen before they've made their own interpretation of the score, what are they doing to those students? Are they saying, I want them to have their own interpretation of these dots on the page, but these dots on the page are themselves, not to be entirely believed, are they? And those who say actually listening is a way in, yeah, maybe that's true, but then the performer might give you ideas that you wouldn't necessarily have had before. Maybe you liked the performer's performance, so you perform like them. Maybe you didn't like it, so you completely throw out their ideas and you get something else. So there are pros and cons to that process as well.
Vanessa, can I give you another
Yep, I've
2 minutes?
finished. So these are my thoughts so far on this. So whether or not a student listens early on in their interaction with the new score may affect the development of familiarity and understanding of structure. The visual may have a larger role in the shaping of familiarity and understanding than is currently emphasised. What we hear is not necessarily what we see. And then it's just finding out ways to interrogate that further and do the generalisation, but a generalisation that is not dictated by this kind of terrible statistical reign that we have on this kind of data, and one that can be useful for the individual music student. So that's where the eye tracking comes in, and hopefully you'll be able to hear me talking about that some other time. So that's it.